Do you know one of the reasons why we have the hope of everlasting life in a paradise earth? A young boy who trusted in God was a key to our hope. His name was David. He was a shepherd in ancient Bible times. He had to be brave and courageous in order to protect his sheep. Once, David had to fight with a wild bear. Even though he was only a lad, he always trusted in God. About 1,000 years before Christ, during the reign of King Saul, village life was very simple. However, Saul was disobedient to God and lacked faith. Jehovah God could no longer trust him. Therefore, he sent his prophet Samuel to choose a better king. This was a dangerous assignment. Why was that? If Saul found out, he would kill Samuel. Jehovah told Samuel to take along a cow so that it would look as if he were visiting just to offer a sacrifice. This would conceal from Saul the real reason for his visit. Samuel finally arrived at Jesse's house in Bethlehem. Now, Jesse had 8 sons. When Samuel saw the eldest son, Eliab, who was tall and impressive, he thought, "Surely this is the one I should choose." But Jehovah warned Samuel, "Do not be fooled by appearances. I see the real man on the inside." Samuel went looking at 6 more of Jesse's sons. But Jehovah did not choose Abinadab, nor Shammah, nor any of the others. "Well," asked Samuel, "are these all the boys?" Jesse said that there was only the youngest son, David, who was out caring for the sheep. "Bring him in," Samuel said. Would Jehovah really choose him? His brothers did not think so. When David walked in, Samuel saw a handsome youth who had beautiful eyes, but was still a mere boy. To everyone's surprise, Jehovah said to Samuel, "This is the one who will put his trust in me. Anoint him to be the next king." From then on, Jehovah's Spirit was with David. Meanwhile, in the king's palace, the servants were trying to please irritable King Saul. Wicked King Saul realized that God had rejected him. This made him have terrifying moods. His servants walked in fear and dread of him. What could be done to make Saul feel better? He needed something to calm his nerves. A court official recommended soothing music played on a harp. A skilled harpist was called. Who did it turn out to be? None other than David. Saul came to love David because his music made him feel better. Eventually, Saul went to war against the Philistines, longtime enemies of Israel who hated Jehovah God. The Israelite army camped in the valley of Elah. They lined up for battle on a mountain on one side, while the Philistines defiantly waited on the other side. The Philistines sent their champion warrior to challenge or taunt Israel. He was a fearsome giant, over 9 feet tall. His name was Goliath. For 40 days, morning and evening, Goliath shouted out, "I taunt the battle lines of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight." Saul and his troops were scared. Nobody wanted to face Goliath. David had brought food to his brothers at the battlefront. He was shocked that no one would face this evil giant who was insulting God. But what could young David do? He boldly offered to fight Goliath. Saul heard about young David's offer and called him in. Putting his trust in God, David said, "Don't be afraid. I will fight this Philistine." Saul exclaimed, "You're too young to face this veteran warrior." David said, "God has protected me in the past. He will save me now from this Philistine. Goliath must die, for he has taunted the living God, Jehovah." So what did David use as weapons? His shepherd's staff, 5 smooth stones, and his trusty sling. That is all. The giant could hardly believe his eyes. Who was this boy coming out to face him? "Am I a dog that you come to me with a staff? Just come over here, and I'll feed you to the birds and the beasts." David answered, "You are coming to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin. I am coming to you with the name of Jehovah." The Philistines panicked and fled. The God of Israel had triumphed at the hand of a mere shepherd boy. Jonathan, Saul's son, had heard about the battle. he was impressed by David's victory over Goliath. Instead of being jealous, he admired him. They became the very best of friends. Jonathan promised to support David to the end. Sometime after David defeated Goliath, Saul put David in charge of the men of war. As time went on, David proved that he was a better soldier than Saul. The women flocked to see Saul and David when they came back from battle. They greeted them with song and dance, crying out, "Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." Saul was furious at such a comparison. He got jealous and angry and began to turn against David. He did not trust him. So Saul began to scheme to have David killed. Saul had a beautiful daughter called Michal. Although Saul did not know it, she was in love with David. Saul's servants realized that she wanted to marry him. When Saul found out about Michal's affection for David, he at last saw his chance to do away with him. Through his servants, Saul made David an offer. He would let David marry Michal if he would kill 100 Philistines. Saul hoped that the Philistines would kill David instead. David took up the challenge, and with his few men, he went out and killed not 100, but 200 of the Philistines. Saul's trick failed, and he was forced to give Michal to David. It was clear that Jehovah was supporting David. This made Saul very afraid. From now on, he would be David's worst enemy. However, Saul still needed David's soothing music. But not for long. Saul's hatred became very clear. David fled to his home. Michal warned him, "If you don't run away tonight, tomorrow you'll be dead." David and his small band of men headed for the wilderness to hide. Saul and his army went after David. David was forced to flee deeper and deeper into the wilderness. What unknown dangers lay ahead? Saul looked everywhere, but he couldn't find David. But he was determined to destroy him. Jonathan, risking everything, went searching for David. He hoped to encourage him. Finding him was no easy task. Jonathan assured David, "Don't be afraid. My father won't find you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you." They promised to be loyal to each other. However, this was the last time that they would be together. In time, Saul found out where David was hiding. With 3,000 of his best men, he closed in on David. However, David's spies told him where Saul was camped. So David crept up on him at night with his bold nephew Abishai. All the guards had fallen asleep. David found Saul sleeping soundly in the middle of the camp. Abishai, eager to kill Saul, whispered to David, "Let me please pin him to the earth with a spear. Once will be enough." David said, "No, I would never think of harming Jehovah's anointed king. Instead, let's take his spear and water jug and then get out of here." From the nearby mountaintop, David called out to the chief of Saul's bodyguard, "Why didn't you watch over your lord the king? Someone could have killed him. Look, I have the king's spear and water jug." Then he said to Saul, "I could have killed you, but I didn't. I trust Jehovah to respect my life and protect me from all my enemies." Saul replied, "You will be blessed, David. Without a doubt, you will be the winner." With that, David left, and Saul returned home. The Israelites continued their war with the Philistines, but this time things did not go well. At Mount Gilboa, the Philistines closed in on Saul. They killed 3 of his sons. Among these was Jonathan, David's most trusted friend. Then the archers found Saul. He fell severely wounded. Rather than be executed by his enemies, he fell upon his own sword and killed himself. David, who had been loyal to Jehovah's king, was so heartbroken that he ripped apart his clothing. He and his men began to weep, wail, and fast. He also composed a funeral song. "I am deeply distressed. Saul and Jonathan have died together. My brother Jonathan, you are my closest and most trusted friend. Years later, God's promise came true when David, who had trusted in Jehovah, was crowned as king over all Israel. David later built his palace in Jerusalem, which came to be called the City of David. He loved Jehovah's worship so much that he had the Ark of the Covenant brought to Jerusalem. The Ark was a sacred chest covered in gold and used in worship of Jehovah. It had been kept outside the city. Eventually, after checking Jehovah's instructions carefully, the Levite priests carried the covered ark on their shoulders with rods. With music and rejoicing, they brought the ark to a tent in Jerusalem. It was a great and happy day for David and for Israel. Skipping about, David was filled with joy. Jehovah's worship was being given first place. David was happy and secure in his royal palace, but he realized that the Ark of the true God was in a simple tent. David wanted to build a beautiful temple for Jehovah. Would Jehovah allow that? Nathan the prophet was sent by Jehovah to tell David his decision. However, to David's surprise, Nathan told him that as a man of war, he would not build the temple. That privilege would go to a future son. David was clearly disappointed. Jehovah made a new promise to David, namely that the kingship would not be removed from his family. Eventually, one of his descendants would rule forever over all the earth. That one would be the best king the world had ever known. However, sometime later, David entered into perhaps the saddest part of his life. He was a good king, but he also made serious mistakes. He watched Bathsheba, another man's wife, bathing. He desired her, sent for her, and took her to his bed. Then he had Bathsheba's husband killed in battle. Jehovah sent Nathan to David to tell him how badly he had sinned. Because of the kingdom promise, he would not lose his life, but Jehovah would punish him severely. David showed that he was very sorry for what he had done. With tears, he wrote in Psalm 51, "Show me favor, O God, according to your loving kindness. Against you I have sinned, and what is bad in your eyes I have done." Jehovah forgave David for his serious sins. Overall, David proved to be a good and faithful king. His rule brought peace and prosperity to the land of Israel. Toward the end of his life, David reminded his son Solomon, who was to be the next king, of the valuable lessons he had learned in life. trust in Jehovah even when the challenges seem too great to overcome. Be strong and trust in Jehovah, even if you have to wait for God's promises to be fulfilled. Walk in God's ways and admit your mistakes. Never stop serving the true God and trusting in Him. Remember that the everlasting kingdom that Jehovah has promised will come through our family line. God's kingdom promise to David started to come true when Solomon became the next king of Israel. This promise eventually led to the anointing of Jesus Christ as king. Jesus, now ruling from the heavens, is the rightful ruler over all the earth. He will reign over a global paradise. Under Christ's rule, David and Jonathan will be resurrected. They will meet again. If you want to be blessed like David, keep on serving Jehovah faithfully. Then you will receive everlasting life with David and Jonathan in God's new world. You too will be rewarded for your trust in God.